Initially, Lake didn't intend to make a sequel to Spark, and even took a few months break from production of the first title. In that time, he started putting together a Unity-based 3D Sonic engine called Hedge Physics, because his breaks are more productive than my work days. It was intended to be a base for others to make 3D Sonic fan games, just as Worlds had given Lake his start several years and One Dimension earlier. And in some fun trivia, Danazine was once again there to help with the coding, supplying the code that is the backbone to the entire program. I sort of love the instructions. To use, get Unity, learn Unity. To make levels, get Blender, learn Blender. Lake doesn't beat around the bushings. Following Spark 1's release, what he first turns his attention to is another attempt at XF. Both Hedge Physics and this second crack at a racing title are stymied by a lack of programming prowess, but ultimately the platformer would once again lap the racing game. Lake had found that Fark made a good impression and he could maybe make a title centered on the robot. It then clicked for him.
And what really motivated me to actually work on Spark 2 was that I got a 3D Sonic game engine ready and was like, I could use this for my original game.
He had just bumbled into the exact tools he needed, that he himself made. So he took that, the art style from Racing Institute, and work began on Fark the Electric Jester. The title was later changed because it was fucking terrible. So opened Spark the Electric Jester 2, with Fark in Armstrong's lab. The game begins by confirming that yes, Fark has been strong-armed out from under Armstrong, as he woefully recounts the events of last game, how he failed in his mission and got his embarrassing moniker. He questions who and what he truly is. Meanwhile Spark, well, he's off on holiday with a blank check given to him by Armstrong. And I sort of lied about Fark's story from last game. It wasn't rewritten per se, but it didn't quite open with Fark at Spark's place. It actually opened with a message declaring that what we're about to play is an alternative world, with Fark's true destiny elsewhere. This places Spark 2 as one of the odder sequels I've played, both because its titular character, while a motivating force, never actually turns up, and because this is actually a do-over of a side story from the prior game, retold in such a way to make it a sequel. I'm impressed by how it's emulating Sonic's absurdist continuity mishmash, and within one game too. Record time, 50,000 points. Armstrong tries to comfort the cogs, saying that Fark isn't such a bad name, which, well, we're playing Spark 2 here, mate, and ultimately offers to root around in his code to see if that might lead to some answers, which amps the android up. But before they can begin... Cheers for that, I was not enjoying looking at him. You can tell from the first cutscene the tone is going to be quite a bit different. Fark is a much more doubtful, introspective character, and the setup is a lot less silly, but a lot more cheesy. I do also appreciate that within the first cutscene, the rival character now has a rival character. Gameplay begins, and it's... alright. The first level, FM City, makes for an okay showcase of what lies ahead. While Spark 1 made its gameplay ideals clear in the first 30 seconds, the sequel takes its entire first stage, which, well, isn't much longer. Opening with ramps leading to two pathways, a player who has a grasp of the momentum-based physics can ramp their way up to the higher lane without needing the slower springs. Next up is a very skippable field of foes, and a spring leading up to a loop-de-loop, which descends into a long straight with speed boosters, letting the player feel how Fark functions at speed. The third segment of the stage is more or less a multi-layered jungle gym, giving the player ample opportunity to climb and test out Fark's various jumps, before one last loop-de-loop and various ramps to run up to the exit, making sure the player knows how to scale surfaces. It's a short and demonstrative opener, useful but not what I would call thrilling, though perhaps its thrill lies in the simple fact of what it is. The music is a remix of FM City from Spark 1, where that track was a starting point before the game and music quickly diverged, revealing its true non-Sonic colours. This mix evokes Sonic Adventure rather heavily, an influence this game commits to. There's a strange thing I learned recently. I'm not smart enough to know if it's true, but, you know, comments can correct me. The modern American accent is closer to Old English than current British accents, which have developed, or devolved if you prefer, into what it is today. Well, Spark 2 is sort of like that in regards to 3D Sonic, and it can talk the talk. Sonic Adventure is my favourite Sonic game. I love how it plays, I love how it feels, and I love how ambitious it is. Of course it has a lot of issues, but I think it's why I have a love for stranger, rougher games today. And I wish 3D Sonic had stayed along this course, translating its 2D concepts into 3D. Instead, later 3D titles sidestep the difficult to implement mechanics like momentum, loops, and complex stage layouts, leading to far more heavily scripted experiences with linear stages and heavy use of set pieces. Where moves like the spin dash were interpretive tools for building speed and getting past obstacles, abilities became set solutions to static problems. It removed all the freedom of older Sonic titles, and the sense of speed has felt relatively shallow since. And to be clear with all this, I do still like 3D Sonic. Quite a bit actually. And I understand why it had to simplify back then, and what we have now is the result of 2 decades worth of complicated problem solving and tinkering, but a greedy part of me has always wished it didn't go down the 3-lane path that it did. What I'm basically saying is that later 3D Sonic titles are the British accents of gaming. It's a bit naff, innit? After Spark 1 diverted from 2D Sonic, Spark 2 is everything cool about 2D Sonic and the adventure games, gameplay of 1 and tone of 2, made modern, with tight, reliable movement, and camera controls that make sense. Not to mention an almost boost-era sense of speed working within an adventure-style framework, all while achieving things Sonic hasn't managed. It can even do proper loop-de-loops. It's a revolution. This is the American accent, the offshoot that's somehow closer to the roots. That's the thrill. And yet, I don't love it. Why is that? It is a sharper, refined version of a gameplay style I adore, with enough new ideas to make it familiar yet distinct. Fark moves okay. Impressive looking and precise maneuvers are easily done after getting to grips with the controls, which doesn't take too long. I rarely feel like the game has screwed me over when I misjudge a jump. Undershooting or overshooting always felt like a misjudgment on my part. It's thrilling to arc through a piece of level like grease lightning. Yet it also isn't. Fark has an almost weightless quality which makes navigation less satisfying. The only feeling of resistance comes from when Fark is running like the wind, which appropriately enough brings us to some Sonic-styled glitchiness. At first, it seems sensible. Because you're moving fast, it becomes harder to turn because of momentum, but the model for how it handles this is jerky. If you try to make small adjustments, it often feels like the game doesn't really register them. Meanwhile, if you push the sticks even slightly too far, the physics can freak out and bring you to a halt. The thrill of running fast is very much present, but always tainted by that bit of unfairness, of having to keep the game's arbitrary nature in the back of your mind, of needing to hit an uncomfortable middle ground while clearing a lot of ground. It weighs down on the gameplay, an irony, because that's the only time there's much weight to go around. After clearing the stage, we come out onto a world map. This menu is a positive addition overall, though obviously it does mean the feeling of a journey of interconnected levels is completely absent, an issue I'll get more into as we go along. Stage 2 is FM Downtown. It's a bit different from any downtown I've ever seen, looking like an impressionist mix of a public bath, skate park, and water treatment plant. It has an odd structure, a series of straightforward large rooms with over and underwater layers. Staying topside is ludicrously easy, and if you just run forward, you miss a majority of what the stage offers, which is very easy to do, as while it is filled with side rooms, hidden nooks, and odd winding paths back onto the main route, there's very little to draw a player's eye to the sides. It's like the level itself is hiding from you. That said, we do get some underwater segments which are no less straightforward, there's no risk of drowning, and then we run down and around some big-ass tunnels. Fark's movement kit is interesting. Apart from removing the dodge, the dash remains and keeps all of its nuances from before, and in this 3D environment is a vital tool in wall running. Oh yeah, on top of loop-de-loops, true freeform wall running is also in, and it controls very nicely. The jumping in this game is very well tuned, both long and short jumps control well, and I do like how the jump is handled. Every time you leave the ground, you're permitted one double jump, a certain number of dashes dependent on your Jester power, and one charge dash, which does bring me to the new moves. The charge dash is basically the spin dash, though charging it does halt vertical momentum, so it can be used as a lifeline in case the player does miscalculate a jump. Again, I find it funny that Spark 1 moved away from Sonic, meanwhile Spark 2 is giving importance to elements 3D Sonic has largely ran away from. There's also a drop dash, and I'll confess, on my first playthroughs I barely remembered this and the charge dash existed. They seem handy, but the stages never really pull them out of the player. The charge Jester dash is a momentum killer due to its charge, and the game never seems to demand the fine control that the drop dash offers. The two of them being relegated to a shift function also hurts their presence. Spark 2 also brings over the homing attack from Adventure, though only certain enemies are susceptible to it. It even has spiked foes to bait players who mindlessly mash it, and this is only the first way in which it rethinks the mechanic. I'll say this now, I think Spark 2 solves the homing attack. Due to the movement Fark has, with his overall speed and ability to use the environment to make massive leaps, the homing attack is relegated to a fallback option for failed jumps. It's the slower, less impressive option. Where in the Sonic series it became a rote mechanic to connect level chunks or else test reflexes, Spark gives it a more interesting and freeform role. This is that same sort of ingenuity I felt playing the old fan games where Lake reevaluates an older mechanic and gives it new meaning. Only this is taking something much more fundamental and making it even more impressive. And on the opposite tact, the Jester powers. There's a lot less of them, they can be found in stages, or bought from a shop on the world map, all for the same price. Yeah, bits now not only refill the health gauge, they act as currency. The shops in this world truly do charge you, letting you pick out powers, or else buy art you would otherwise have to hunt down in stages. Base Fark has a fairly fleshed out kit in this game, and perhaps as a result of that, the Jester powers aren't as mechanically different. They're closer to animation sets than distinct movesets. Their actual difference is muted. Only Edgy edges the others out thanks to its free air dashes and absolutely wonderful shadow send-up. It even uses the hover boots in fights, which is rad as hell. Though this does bring me to combat. On the outskirts of town, Fark catches up to EJ, with the Doctor nowhere in sight. EJ says he has orders from Freon to kill Fark, and unlike last time, it's a surprise that the big Robo is back. But rather than face us himself, EJ sicks Rhino Dino on us, and thus begins our first boss fight. Alright, I'm gonna have to talk fast for this because this isn't gonna take long. Combat in Spark 2 is a slap fight between soap bars and it is not clean. It plays very loosely like Metal Gear Rising with light attack strings and heavy finishes. There's no real utility to different combos, no launchers that work on bosses or utility moves. So once I figured out the most damaging string, I gave the bosses a combo splatter, an all-you-can-eat buffet of battering. As you deal out damage, you build your static bar, which now offers an ongoing damage multiplier which does more to hurt variety than foes. As like in Spark 1, you can cash in your power bar for a really big attack, but a constant damage multiplier never really feels worth risking a big charge attack, especially in a combat system this fast and unreliable. And no, you don't need to vary combos to build meter. Link may be bewitched by Bayonetta, but these brawls are basic. Okay, the boss is probably over. And compounding on all of this is the parry. Fark has had a firmware update, making him far firmer and much more hard-wearing. Now instead of freezing you in place and having a semi-tight timing, the parry window is seconds long and does not stop you from bringing the pain. It doesn't inhibit movement whatsoever. It's amusing, but makes the combat even more Farkical, as boss battles all devolve into rushing in, spamming the same combo, and the moment an enemy flashes or looks to move, hold down parry and keep slapping away. And what with the particle effects, the hardest part of battles is seeing some of the less telegraphed attacks amidst all of the fireworks. The bosses try to be distinct from one another, but this really comes down to stopgap measures, delays or impediments to an imperfect routine, and beyond perfect parry. It never actually feels like I'm battling the boss but fighting their health bar. And to get even crazier, the parry can still deflect stage hazards. Spinning blades, trains, the cannon of a spaceship from inside of the barrel. But this is boring. We've been here before. So now, it can even parry the hereafter. You can parry death itself. So that's incredible, but it's so easy to do that it does defang the stages, turning them from obstacle courses to soft play arenas. I spent more time in parry here than in the bloody Saboteur. There is a difficulty selection in this game. All it does is affect damage received, but I think it should have also made block timing stricter. This is solely a feature of the gimmick challenge difficulty. I think these two should have risen in tandem. There's a new boss track and it's pretty good. Much like Fark's previous boss music, it's meant to have lyrics which kick in at the halfway mark. They're fun in that butt rock way and naturally laden with foreshadowing. Foreshadowing which relates to this game and the sequel in slightly different ways, which is pretty nifty. But since these rumbles rarely broke 70 seconds, and I cut a good few of them down to half a minute, I never actually got to hear much of these lyrics. Spare the lightning rod and spoiler the boss fight, I suppose. After the fight, Fark goes to get the lay of the land, and is surprised by a familiar face. Romolo! Having been freed from the first Freon virus by the Doctor, he's out here trying to find the guy. Now disconnected from the net, he figures himself safe from Freon's current influence. This story subscribes to the idea that the internet rots your brain. In an amusing bit, Fark aggressively demands everything Romolo knows, learning what EJ is up to. He then awkwardly apologizes for the lip before making his way. I find it cute that he's literally not built to be polite. Romolo then flies over to Astra. They share some clandestine banter about how they have to keep watch of Fark, and how as an agent of Clarity, she fears he could be a worse threat than the big man himself. Spark 2 is going to be by far and away the wordiest entry in the series. Almost like a second go at Chrono Adventure, though this one is handled a lot better. Where Chrono had me feeling like I was only getting unhelpful snippets and incomplete pieces of a larger world it really wanted me to understand, Spark 2 is far better at actually building intrigue which unfolds in a natural way. Its answers are easy to guess, but I'll take that over the convoluted mess of Chrono. I don't want to be chasing the story, I want to have a fun time following it. Next up is Floria Highway, which makes for a nice burst of speed. A long series of winding roads linked by what I presume are construction platforms. It's a fun run, but highlights more than any other a consistent issue of Spark 2's stages. The levels are often barren and really struggle to pull the player into challenge and excitement. I went over how fun I find how far Fark can frisk, but I also went over vast swaths of the bloody stages doing so. It's a strength and a weakness. A ton of challenges which in other games would be involved, multi-jump affairs and seem designed to be here, are sailed over with nary an interaction. This issue extends to enemies, which hurts them more than you ever will. In an interview which came out around the time of the game's release, Lake admits a frustration that in the original title, enemies could be bypassed far too easily, and Spark 2 had not solved the problem. There's an irony in that while this stage is perhaps the worst for it, it's also the first of just 3 mandatory combat encounters. Stage mini-bosses are far lesser in quantity and quality. You can tell in this game that Lake is figuring out 3D design where the prequel was a result of years of 2D tinkering. The following Floria plant is a bit better. Sort of. This area is built around lava pools and wall running. I love darting up the lava flow with a series of ramp jumps. It's one of the few obstacles the game has which feels properly tuned for the player's agility. You're also sent sprinting through lava tunnels, and I'm pretty certain the game is only happy for you to run along the ceiling and bypass all of the platforming below. Stages do somewhat distinguish themselves with their own rhythms and obstacles, but as said, it can't quite find its feet when it comes to keeping yours on the ground, and attempts to do so are awkward speed killers which hardly even work, rarely halting the player for long. This all goes along with the parry in making stages feel frictionless and solutions samey. On a casual playthrough, level-to-level experiences are rather similar, and that's because you can't feel bumps in the road when you're a mile in the sky. Electricity follows the path of least resistance. Make that too easy and you make a game where you essentially skip all the meaningful content without even thinking about it. The first time I finished Fark, I felt like I'd barely played a game. Does the fault lie with me or it? I'm genuinely of two minds about this because despite how critical I'm being, there is a thrill in doing all of this, in seeing these laid out, intricate challenges and cutting the Gordian loop-de-loop. But it's not exactly a well-rounded experience. Meanwhile, some robots are looking at Fark's stupidly round bonts. This is our boss squad, and I've grown to like these guys. And that goes double for double. We have, Double, who I've now introduced twice. He's the leader of the pack, and rather upset that the liberation of robots is almost at hand, because that means the killing's done. Flint is the conscience of the group, seemingly loyal to Double, but clearly not quite as gung-ho, and he cares a good deal for Float. The two found her during the fighting, she has no memories and seemingly just does as these two do out of friendship. And for now, they're confused by what they see, doubting that Fark's body can be as powerful as the readings warn them. Double is willing to go after the robot, but isn't really amped up by the idea. Then the scene is stolen by EJ, shrieking at the free to get to work. And they're unimpressed, only going along with Freon for kicks. Put in his place and embarrassed, EJ can only stew in his weakness. This scene is where the Spark 2 demo ended, and that demo is the closest this series has ever come to actual controversy. But for the last reason you might expect. Buckle in. It turns out that Spark 2 also saw rewrites, and that's because it was originally going to feature excessive swearing. And I gotta ask, what the fuck is all that about? People found it really out of place and off-putting, and while Lake did push back, he did ultimately remove the cursing. And honestly, I do think the game is better without it. Even though it does have a comedic point, it's clearly over the top on purpose and there is a target for the parody. Double and EJ are the only two to F and Jeff, and they're the edgiest characters by far. But to focus on EJ, I really do find him an interesting character conceptually and in execution, and his colourful commentary was a part of that. EJ and Fark feel like really interesting, contrasting interpretations of Sonic's rivals, particularly Shadow. Fark represents all of the earnest aspects of that kind of character, a moodier and more serious version of the light-hearted lead, one which complements the main character's own temperament while being able to carry their own story. He's Shadow in Sonic Adventure 2. Meanwhile, EJ is everything shallow about Shadow, an edgy out-of-place twat trying too hard to be cool. He's Shadow the Hedgehog in Shadow the Hedgehog. Only while that game is an utter cock-up, here Lake is in on the joke. Absolutely no other character respects EJ, and he's the punching bag of every scene he's in. The swearing adds to his ineffectual edge, but is distracting and unnecessary to make the bit work. To put that aside, I love this conflict between what is essentially two takes on the same character. One everything sort of interesting about them done well, and one everything superficial about them done knowingly. Spark may be a send-up to everything that inspired it, but it does remix those ideas in fascinating ways which lets it offer something unique. But it took a couple of goes for this to work for me. The first time I played through Spark 2, I really didn't care for much of it, story especially. I'm not sure what mood I was in, it's just nothing was connecting. Perhaps coming off of how much I enjoyed the first Spark, I was sitting there wishing it had more of what the 2D title offered. I've been harsh up until now and I've got criticisms left, but I'm going to try and work in some of my more positive reappraisals of Spark 2 from here on out. A few months ago I livestreamed the entire series to show it off, especially to a couple of mates of mine. I had just beaten 3 and was really enthusiastic about Spark. I needed to show people. It may have been the lighter streaming for fun atmosphere and me going into 2 with a "I promise guys this gets better next game" sort of framing as I expected disappointment, but we wound up having a blast. The goofy story reveals and melodrama hit us just right. What did I miss first time around? Well, embarrassingly enough for me, this game tells you how to appreciate it right out of the gate, and it's exactly on my wavelength. This is the start screen, and this is the menu and stage clear background. Metal Gear Rising and Sonic Adventure 2 are its touchstones. And then we have this.
It's got a bit of that sort of action movie cheese to it, which makes it really enjoyable, instead of like super grim, dark, and serious.
I wanted to make it as cheesy. I wanted to make it as cheesy as I could. It was my goal with it. That's
amazing to hear. That makes me so happy. I feel like the Sonic series has never matched Sonic Adventure 2 in terms of trying to take itself seriously, but also being kind of like silly at the same time.
I love having a game made by someone else who appreciates the goofy buy-in of Sonic Adventure 2. That's how to appreciate this story. It's of the type that's taking itself seriously, but the author knows how off the wall and goofy it is and has fun with that balance. Willing to accept the juxtaposition of silly and serious, and on the second go around its charms work their way through a lot better. Granted, it is lacking in presentation. Sonic Adventure 2's goofiness is bolstered by sloppy vocal direction.
Fine, then just take them. They stink like echidnas.
Bad mixing, and much more animated cutscenes. All things which are hard to do convincingly, intentionally, especially with Lake's resources. But this does make Spark 2 feel muted. Dialogue-wise, unlike Chrono Adventure and Lake's first take on Spark 1's story, I don't find the banter grating, but not exactly great. It's for the most part fine. Despite the much larger cast, it's far more deft in giving characters distinct voices and goals, which get at least a little exploration, even if they're not quite fully charted. Anyway, I had a turnaround on the story. So let's talk about how I also wound up enjoying the gameplay. In the shop menu, there's a special reward costing 0 bits. Super Fark. To unlock it, we have to get every speed and score medal in the game. A daunting task. And I loved it. The next stage, Foresta Blanca, nice little Sonic Adventure 2 riff, is a stage I somehow always forget just before booting it up and going, oh, this is really fun. A foggy, snowy forest which trades the curvy highways and platforms for rolling, unnatural scenery. This is Spark 2's snowy peak of momentum-based platforming, and it's a joy to just jump around this place. And speedrunning this stage, much like speedrunning this entire game, takes that to 11, as you really have to grasp the physics and master ramping off of hills. I complained how empty the game feels, but you add a speed requirement and suddenly that empty space sets the pace. The barren stages become intricate puzzles of cut-throughs and opportunities for big time saves hidden in plain sight. FM City, a fairly straightforward entry level, becomes the most exacting challenge present, with a 50-second time limit that I've only shaved by milliseconds. Some sections need to be done perfectly, and they need to be done perfectly so you can bypass others. Cheeky inclines which on normal playthroughs seem merely ornamental become instrumental to launching yourself past springs and lifts. So many levels fundamentally change on a speedrun. Hidden routes and devious jumps which actually push the limits of Fark's moveset. Let me show you my favourite jump in the game. I felt so good figuring that out, and it remained gratifying to clear on my numerous attempts to crack the remainder of the stage. I slighted the charge and drop dashes, they were cold to me, but under this pressure they turn into diamond medals. The second a charge dash takes to get ready takes on a real risk reward, as it opens up many means to progress. Meanwhile the drop dash quickly restores your jump, and can be used to hit downslopes faster for extra speed. That little bit of extra precision becomes incredibly important. And it's great how the charge dash maintains the nuances of the regular dash. While it does give great speed, you need to use it in conjunction with the geometry to really run like the wind. These challenges also elevate the Jester powers, making their slight differences become meaningful. Edgier's charge attack is a momentum-affected triple jump. It will only slow a descent, but rocket a Fark already headed up. The Biker Jester can store a boost that's weaker than a charge dash and stricter in its movement, but it can actually be carried. It doesn't halt your movement. This gets even crazier in Spark speedrunning with magnet dashing. I am not on this level, I just wanted to show you this. Now I was certain I would enjoy the speedruns, but I figured the score attacks would be a dull affair, just travelling about the stage and hoovering up points like Henry in a thumbtack factory. How wrong I was. The way Spark 2 handles score is new to me. First up, you build a multiplier throughout the stage. It can never decrease, but raising the number requires getting good amounts of points in quick bursts. It's a fairly slow-paced combo meter. Then on top of this is a 5-minute time limit. Go over, and your score rapidly plummets back to 0. What this results in is a more complex speed medal, one focused on deft routing and considered pacing. I wound up loving it. You can't just thoughtlessly bumble through, grabbing bits and breaking bots. You have to be smart about it. Grabbing every point is far less important than knowing hotspots you can quickly navigate between while steadily advancing towards the end of the stage so that you don't risk running over the time limit. You've got to play this like Beavis and Butthead, looking for ways to quickly score, figuring out what areas have points and which are pointless. Being able to not only speedily navigate across the stage, but how to quickly climb up, down, and between routes becomes vital. Your movement is tested in ways even more varied than the standard speed medals. Meanwhile, the enemies, typically so easily ignored, become vital, especially the rare but incredibly valuable mini-boss robots. While the combat doesn't become good, it's now part of something that is. On each failed run, I could feel myself improving bit by bit, and finally making the goal was always rewarding, feeling like a culmination of all of my planning and practice, giving it the sense of a well-considered challenge. For all of my love, I do have gripes with it. While I just praise the multiplier system, and I find it leads to really tense finishes where nearing the time limit, you just start gaining hundreds of thousands of points for every little thing, making the wins feel close yet big, it's so unusual a multiplier system, and it starts ramping up so exponentially that it took many medals before I had anything approaching a grasp of how close to my goal I ever really was. As it feels really sudden how enemies go from a few thousand a pop to tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands, and it was hard to gauge how much I needed to do to make them that valuable. It's unintuitive to say the least. And while I did undeniably have fun with these challenges, it doesn't solve the underlying issue. The main game is incredibly lacking for substance. A casual playthrough of the main stages demands very little of a player and offers not much more. On to the next level. Don't know how to pronounce that. Actually, it's quite fitting, because up next is a mysterious haunted castle. We join Flint and Float as they look out towards a glowing spire, sure that Spark will scale it to plot his course. Float is to ambush him at the apex, where they either expect her to take the win, or else Fark will run and get caught by Flint or Double, who are positioned ahead at Technoria City. This seems like a really flimsy plan, but hey, we need those one-on-one boss fights. I'm rather mixed on this scene. The two again question if Fark can really be that dangerous. Like Float, he's a custom model, his code only matching one other robot, and that's Freon, which is less foreshadowing and more a narrative solar eclipse, and makes it even more unbelievable they're going at him one by one. If there is anything in this scene that works, it's the oddly well done and strangely subtle dynamic between Flint and Float. Flint seems apprehensive to send Float off to fight Fark, as well as questioning her lack of memories, on Double's suspicion anyway, as it leaves her with no clear reason why she fights. which Float brushes off by joking about how their master isn't exactly a saint. Flint can't argue, and just asks her to be careful, which makes her happy. This is a scene which is better on a rewatch, with more information given later about who these two are. I like it as a re-examination of a boss squad, something closer to MGS2 than Metal Gear Rising, with somewhat complex relationships. Flint and Float have a somber quality which doesn't agree with the lightning bolt pacing. They're the actual emotional center of the game, but they're off-center. Anyway, Fark begins the stage, and I've got to say, the parry isn't the only thing that makes the world of Spark 2 feel like a blockland. I said this was a castle. It even takes inspiration from Heroes' Hang Castle mechanically. Actually, the entire stage zeroes in on Heroes. And while it is harsh to compare the presentation of a full studio game against a one-man effort, let alone their first full-fledged go at 3D, I can't pretend I'm fond of how this looks. This doesn't sell me on being a castle, more an abstract series of shapes which doesn't really suggest any kind of structure. This might be appealing to some, and in the right scenario I might dig this look. But here it doesn't do much for me, and it does occasionally hamper gameplay. Because the settings are so surreal, if the player loses the thread of where to go, it can be tricky to pick it up again. Though it's here that this issue is at its most aggressive. Befitting its apparent theme, this is a topsy-turvy trial, where navigation is meant to be more fiendish. But I doubt hidden pits obscured by everything looking exactly the same was part of the plan. Alongside climbing semi-visible architecture that often appears indistinct from mere decoration, only standing out because of how sparse such ornamentation is. This quality does vary level by level. Some stages suggest locations, others mere approximations, which does create inconsistency. And none of this is to say the abstract stages are always devoid of charm. I love the level theming of the otherwise forgettable Scary Astropolis, the use of trains as a hazard returns, and the mix of old-fashioned brickwork, high-tech rail station, and Zen gardens is a pleasing mixture. Though I do wish it looked like anything in particular or told a little tale of the world in itself. And that's how I feel about a good few of these stages. At the top of the tower, Fark confronts Float, who's also a bit let down at this world, for reasons stranger than mine. This exchange is more than a little bizarre, not even Fark can quite follow. He gets sad when Float reveals it's a fact she learned from her friends, asking, "You have those?" And I'm thinking, Fark, mate, they have one of yours. Okay, actually no, I wouldn't consider Armstrong a friend either. I do appreciate the moment that follows, where Fark responds not with fear or anger that Float's friends also want him dead, but is completely nonplussed. I love that he shares Spark's flippancy towards danger for such drastically different reasons and expresses it in a different way. That despite being a month old and obviously quite naive and new to the world, he's already this world weary. And this throws Float off. Having lost her memories, her only point of reference is Flint and Double, and Fark's attitude genuinely gets to her, which is an intriguing character beat. Anyway, 60 seconds and 2 forms later and she's dead. She is, to me, one of the trickier bosses. Timing parries is slightly harder because it's like trying to have a rumble in a rave. Her second phase is actually easier because she eases up on the light show. Astra reveals herself, and then starts guilt-tripping him over killing Float, giving us the reveal that none of this was out of some grander goal, just loyalty to her friends. And in the strangest swerve so far, telling us that Float is actually an android, a formy girl trapped in a robot body, abandoned by the military and thought dead, but kept alive through the machine. And I'm just sat here thinking, alright there, Drebin, you gonna get Romolo to do a little monkey impression? This bit of whiplash is where the game pivots, with grim revelations about each character and the tone turning dour. While I'm fond of this story, I feel its compact length does constrain it here, as it could have benefited from a more gradual shift. I wish there was more electricity in the air, not a sudden, awkward jolt. I like the reveal that Float's reason for fighting was that simple and her friends never really knew. I take Flint as harboring some guilt for saving her because that put her right back into danger, but I'm going to be honest, I'm making these comments with a lot of hind and foresight. Not to mention having time to sit down, log these scenes and read and watch them back. There's stuff there, but it isn't all working, as these two have barely any screen time and the cryptic, hesitant dialogue is clunky. When it comes to effective depth, this story's reach exceeds its grasp. And with the guilt trip failing to floor Fark, he heads off for Technoria City to rescue his... acquaintance? Shantoria Town is a great speedrun stage, which works well. There's nothing to see here, being only a marginal improvement from the castle in terms of suggesting a space. This all changes just one level later, as we quickly go from Favela to Favourite with Technoria City. As Fark arrives, he's contacted by a mysterious AI known as Clarity, made by Armstrong to stop Freon. Fark gets little and has less time to wander, as EJ flies overhead and Fark gives pursuit. And I've got another grievance. Sorry. Now, while the castle was me arguing against the topic at its weakest, Technoria is me arguing against it at its strongest. This stage is a showing of what Lake can be capable of, but cannot yet consistently achieve. Technoria is a beautiful cityscape negotiated skyscraper by skyscraper. The sense of scale is impressive and I love the vibrancy. Everything is neon lit and the rooftop parks offer a gorgeous contrast, accented by giant billboards stretching off across the landscape. This level is a visual treat. So I'll admit, this is a very individual complaint, and with the heightened focus on character story, it isn't something that's missing without replacement, the focus is elsewhere. But even at this game's best, it doesn't tell a world story or give a sense of a cohesive setting the same way the 2D title did. It's three-dimensional, but with so much less depth. Let's put aside the city lights so the plot can get yet darker. Fark catches up with EJ. No patience left for his taunting. He demands to know where the doctor is and a fight quickly ensues, which... yeah, he puts up about as much of a scrap as you might expect. A beaten EJ retreats to Flint and Double, getting about as much sympathy as you'd expect. And up here, we don't find the doctor. Freon arrives, announcing the death of Armstrong, but where he left just mysteries in his wake, Freon brings answers. Freon's true name is Unit 1, and Fark's Unit 2. And then Freon just kinda disappears. He's just gone after this shot with no announcement or explanation. It's a weird misstep in a delightfully melodramatic moment. Right in time for Double to steal the scene. Double joking about a touching family reunion, just riffing on what's before him, before trying to get under Fark's shell, I suppose, for being more beaten up about his dad than the doctor. And when Fark tries to hit back that Double doesn't actually care for the liberation of robots or any high-minded ideal, Double is delighted. This is more of what I wanted. Big emotions and very expressive dialogue. This is the game's comfort zone. Double is very clearly inspired by Sundowner, and my god is he a really nice take on the character, capturing everything entertaining about him with his own little zest. And just like Sundowner, his fight's over before you bloody well know it. And his gimmick, an encore. Or as the French would call it, bis. And, cut to Astra and Romolo stood over Freon's limp body, apparently remote-controlled. They wonder what his game is, and then Astra announces they've got a job to do. I like to imagine Freon delivered the news, "I'm your pops," and then Pop powered down and hit the ground. From awkward joke to awkward endgame, we next join Fark boarding a train to... somewhere. A memorable stage with a fun premise and a solid ramp-up in difficulty as there's less ground to go around. He then starts scaling a tower. Into space. I love Titanic Tower. It's such a fun platforming playground and the music gives it such a light and bouncy tone. Which is cool and all, But we're doing this because this is the literal rising action as we're on our way to fight our genocidal robot dad. We're breaching the atmosphere, and buddy, the atmosphere's off. To go back to the last game once more, once you get this big plot dump, the rest of the game is a thrill ride and you're equipped to know why things are happening. Spark 2 is kind of the opposite. I know now where Fark is going and why, but it feels like once all of the inciting questions are answered at the 3/4 mark, everything awkwardly jaunts onwards towards a conclusion without telling the player what Fark is doing. And that's incredibly funny given he is literally running into space. This is all especially ironic come Endgame. We cross paths with Flint one last time, giving us a pretty hardcore line. He swears revenge for Float, but says if he's the one to die today, do not trust Clarity. The battle ends with Flint beating a retreat. And there we go. The saga of Float and Flint ends there, sort of anticlimactically. At least for now. Then we get to Planetary Stripe. This is another great stage. It's one of the most mechanically simple, but works so well in story, pacing, and challenge. We're running along the ring of the planet, I think. What's going on over there? That's all this stage is. There are no foes or gimmicks beyond that save for gravity shifting to change lanes. All we're doing is running on thin runways. Something which I've said is mechanically stilted. Why it's so cool is that it feels like we're ramping up the pace in tandem with the story, rushing towards a conclusion, and this is matched by the central tension of the stage. With the gravity gimmick, winding tracks, and space backdrop, it's hard to tell when you're the right way up, meaning that slowing down, hesitating, or failing to stay on course may be a death sentence. And if you do survive, getting back up to speed is difficult by itself. It all sells an idea that if Fark puts a foot wrong now, he's already dead. It's a strong level, great individually and in its place in the story, while appropriate pacing-wise, which is sadly not the norm. So much of Spark 2 is made up of elements and ideas which are nice taken on their own, but aren't working together as a whole. And on that note, this whole ramping up towards the finale is undercut by the lack of feeling of a journey and the world map. This screen has undeniable benefits, but in combination with the awkward storytelling, it repeatedly kills momentum and makes this whole endgame lack for impact. Luckily, the next level again manages to claw out some individual excitement. Welcome to Hyperath Fleet, a remake of the best stage from Spark 1. It's an impressive level. I'm sort of sad we don't get a remix of its music like FM City, instead getting a chopped down variation, which is unfortunately appropriate. Lake cannot yet recreate the sense of internal progression in storytelling. It lacks that dimension. Like the escape sequence set piece is somewhat recreated, but I didn't defeat a boss or do anything. I just dropped down a shaft and shafted the whole ship somehow. Time to go. This is a 3D translation of a 2D stage, and fittingly for Fark, it's a bit of a machine translation. I apologise if I'm coming off harsh. The irony is that while this whole thing is a throwback, it's also a sign of things to come, which will soon be done a lot better. There's bombast, bespoke stage hazards, a sense of place, and actual set pieces. And most importantly, the tighter quarters and stage layouts actually push the player into facing danger head on. I mean, the parry still parries, but hey, despite my gripes, it is a very good stage. And we're not the only ones beating our feet to get on the fleet, as the fittingly named Astra has also made her way up. And she's not pleased. EJ? Okay, never mind us. I'm more impressed with a guy who limped into orbit. When he sees Fark, he starts raging, but his yelling is interrupted, and we get a strange revelation. The Doctor's fine. Well, he isn't fine, I mean, look at him, but he's alive. EJ complains about his lot in life, and then turns around to see a lot of him. So if the idea he's a riff on Shadow the Hedgehog a la Shadow the Hedgehog wasn't clear enough for you, there it is. I really do like EJ and how the game handles how pathetic he is, and in this moment, he goes from comedically pitiable to genuinely so. Astra runs him through, and then the rest of him explodes for some reason. I'll assume she did that. Her attention then turns to Fark. With the reveal that he's Freon's son, she believes he's here to take his place, and that he rejected his mission from Clarity. Fark then asks his big question. It's a central theme that's handled a little awkwardly. This is meant to be the Shadow/Raiden moment where they think for themselves, but that lightning doesn't quite strike thrice. I'm gonna be honest, I feel like much of this ending fits better with Fark's former origin story, a product of Armstrong built purposefully to take down Freon, instead of being Freon's son built for reasons unknown. I say that knowing how the plot falls apart were that the case in what's coming later, But none of this really flows for me, and that's because Fark has been completely self-directed. He chose to go after the Doctor, and after learning his origins, chose to go after Freon, all along surrounded primarily by characters who are intentionally mysterious in their motives. They're loyal to means, mates, and manipulators. The only two who are wholly dedicated to missions are EJ and Astra. Again, I find this plot entertaining, and I believe the thematic stuff is done more for stylistic send-up and motivation rather than a big message, but all of the subtext is wired up wrong. Fark says whatever he does from now on will be his own decision, so the Agent of Clarity makes an astronomical mistake. It's a shame Romolo has been reduced to a bit player. He was a fun boss at one point. Astra is struck down, and Romolo makes a startling discovery. Astra was to fake being an organic to carry out her mission. The last we see of Romolo is him grieving over his friend's body. Genuinely, this is the last we're going to see of him in the series. Bye, Romolo. And into the final level, the excellently named Apocalypse Thruster. It plays like a combination of the prior two, with the thin runways of Planetary Stripe and the relentless danger of Hyperath. The game's just showing off at this point. If a 3D Sonic game ever put the player on a beam this thin with the controls and camera it has and asked us to actually platform over the thing, it would be a Sonic misadventure, rather than the intimidating yet perfectly doable challenge it is here. And this all culminates with us walking over the thruster. A terrifying prospect, especially when it's the last hurdle of a speed medal, asking for the most delicate movement right at the last second with the threat of cremation inches away. But the real fire here is the music. I'd call it my favorite original stage track, but I'm just having a laugh. Honestly, the soundtrack for 2 I just didn't find as memorable. Perhaps partly down to the less evocative stages. Maybe it's down to not being stuck with them for 10-minute chunks. It maintains one's eclecticism, but it's not the 100% hit rate of that first game. Fark comes face to face with Freon, who reveals his plan. Freon was built by Armstrong to guard Megarath, and the supercomputer's true purpose was clarity, an AI that would safeguard life. Unfortunately, because Armstrong is the most useless scientist going, he majorly bungled it. The AI went rogue and decided that to truly protect life, some would have to go. Freon was compelled by Clarity to eradicate the Formies, an order he couldn't ignore. The robot uprising began, but it was with Freon's defeat at Spark's hands he learned the truth, that robots too would be eliminated. The virus was actually Clarity, and she's now spread across the entire planet's network. The only option left is to crash Megarath into the surface, wiping out all life and Clarity along with it. He's a bit of a one-trick pony, but this is a decent escalation from last time, or de-escalation if you prefer. Then, he offers Fark a chance to join him and stand at the beginning of a new world, where every being will be built for a purpose. Fark refuses to join Freon as a destroyer, and vows to stop him and Clarity both through other means. Freon bluntly asks, why, if he even cares about this world? And in an answer I find very interesting, Fark hesitates. He looks inside himself, and there's nothing there. He doesn't care, but seeing Spark and his simple happiness, he thinks there has to be something worthwhile, something that he wants to find for himself. I find this does salvage the previous scene a little, and it's overall a character beat I'm quite fond of. While the twist of Fark's origin can only be made more obvious were the words "property of Freon" filed into Fark's thorax, and even then only marginally so, there is a fun irony in that Fark set off on much of this adventure to discover who he is and set himself apart from Spark. He learns that while he's only superficially a copy of the Jester, he is a literal clone of Freon. And when confronted with Dad's ultimate goal, he finds himself, as we'll come to learn begrudgingly, wanting to be more like the other guy, the one who jerked him around and stole his purpose. It's a funny thing that in this very weirdly told, cheesy, often daft, but usually entertaining story, it does occasionally hit on a very deft and intricate bit of characterization, often understated and just as oddly told as anything else. Not to mention, I just enjoy wrapping up Fark's arc, not with a definitive answer, but further uncertainty. Though I'd like this more if Fark had much of anything going on beforehand. Ironically, the character I praised for being an intentionally shallow comparison was also more developed than him, and that's awkward to contemplate. And so begins the final battles, and it's the same old, same old. After his defeat, Fark finds himself in a void, face to face with Freon's true form. The prototypical son returns, turning an in-joke around into an actual development. A weakness given to him by Armstrong. His actual body is tied to this chair. Every version of him we've faced is a robot shell given his data, which, I'm gonna be honest, I have no idea how much of a weakness that really is for anyone but this guy in particular. Unit 2, Fark, is also a copy of his fundamental data, but with one very odd difference. Legs? Or that. Immediately putting that power to excellent use, Fark adopts the kookiest super form I've ever seen, and I'm on board. This whole ending sequence still has a bit of a spark to it. Even if I feel in pacing and scale it can't really approach the first game, an issue of structure as well as a struggle of tone, this is me looking back on it and being in too deep. In the moment, playing it, streaming it with friends, it's easy to get caught up in the silly, imaginative hype of it, half laughing with the game and half really excited to be there for the ride. It's only when you stop and examine it you realise it may not be completely up to code. This battle is joined by an amazing new vocal track from Andy Tunstall, which thanks to the mid-fight cutscenes, you'll actually hear. These lyrics probably the clearest image of Fark we're going to get, joined by a nice callback to the lyrical theme from the first title, as well as being a remix of that game's ultimate boss track. It's the moment Fark, inspired by Spark, decides to be his own person. Fark is still filled with self-doubt and knows there will be troubles ahead, but is ready to face them head-on, assured of his free will, and ready to step out of the shadow of the two people who shaped him, while acknowledging there are parts of them he aspires to. It's good stuff, it is a bit of interesting character depth. The development may be quick, but it is another little hint that he is now thinking for himself. And gameplay-wise, it's still a boss fight. How is Super Fark in ordinary stages, since I did go to the trouble of getting him? It's a bit boring, honestly, but I don't actually begrudge it because I had fun enough getting him. The game ends with Fark proving how cool he is. On the ground, Armstrong and Flint look on, knowing their jobs are far from done. And we once again get those charming credits. These really do benefit from 3D. Another endearing, humble beat to go out on. Thus ends Spark. Or Spark 2. Or the Spark 2 remake of the Fark story in Spark 1. A fun if flawed game, but an important step forward. On my first playthrough, I didn't care much for this game. It failed to grab me. On my second playthrough, streamed to friends and an audience, with my own expectations set low, the half-there gameplay and absurd plot were a joy. Coming back to these levels with more skill made them more fun as I showed off the goofy physics and sped through stages. I jumped higher and left with a heightened impression. Another replay by myself to get all the medals, and I found how the challenges gave the game some juice. My experience and shifting opinion of Spark 2 is an odd one. The gameplay is a refinement of a style abandoned all too soon, and is undeniably an improvement upon it in theory. But that gameplay's let down because it lacks what Adventure had in variety, challenge, and, well, adventure. But if you push this gameplay to its limits, there is fun and friction to be found. It shouldn't be on the player to give the floaty mechanics weight, but it is undeniably there. And the story is sort of the same. Odd both in the moment experiencing it and examined more deeply, with odd and uncommon contradictions. In the moment, the story can be goofy and entertaining, but you have to see past its very muted presentation. I'm glad the game doesn't have voice acting, but it needed something to make its unclear tone more apparent. Yet in the right mood, the right environment, examined the right way, the goofiness comes through. The plot, when looked back on or examined more deeply, can fracture further. It's not a tale really calling out for much scrutiny, but there are interesting moments and ideas which work well in the abstract, some of which are salvaged by the sequel lending context. There are beats, which are really fun to ruminate on, and others which leave you more questioning than wondering. The conflict between Fark and Edgier is a really fun riff on the rival dynamic, but Fark himself feels like an empty vessel without that contrast, and his own story only gets interesting in the 11th hour, or the 2nd if you play it casually. A robot built for purposes unknown, who fails in what he believes to be his goal and is then left adrift. When his chance at an identity is stolen from him, he goes on an adventure to get that chance back, and in the process creates it for himself. That's really neat on paper, but that idea needs more time than it's afforded, and Fark never really feels plugged into his own plot. In this story of Fark trying to find himself, it often feels like Lake is struggling just as much. It's a story that's at its most enjoyable when it's being ridiculous, when characters make grand, hammy proclamations. But in its more quiet moments, its ruminations and explanations in why things are happening that it can't ever find the right words. It feels wanting and can't quite land the Metal Gear style character beats. Subtlety is not its strength. Double is a fun show stealer, and there are hints of unease between him and his two cohorts, Flint and Float. And you may think I've given their story a little too much credit. And in this title alone, I have. Before Spark 2 finished development, Lake said he had a really ambitious game in mind for the future. While he kept it vague, he said Spark 2 was the groundwork for this title, and seems to have accidentally called it filler for what's to come.
I mean, I have this game that I have in mind. Spark 2 is kinda a filler to that game. It really isn't. It does have like some really important plot points that couldn't really be dismissed, but yeah, it's pretty much a kind of a gap between this game I have planned and the original Spark.
All along, what we've really been playing has been setting the stage for what comes next. And what's weird is, that may not have meant Spark 3. This gameplay foundation, these story elements, might have led to something else. The first time I beat Spark 2, my final thoughts were wishing that Lake had stuck to 2D, and considering how I massively prefer 3D platformers and have longed for someone to pick up Adventure's torch. This was a damning appraisal. But at that time, I hadn't played before and after the sequel. I'm not sure I'd even heard of Chrono Adventure. What I didn't know then that I know now is just how much Lake improves each and every time. In the end, the next game is not going to give me what I wished for. It will instead give me everything I didn't know I wanted, and a whole lot more.